It was a still, gloomy afternoon in Salem, March 18, 1848. The sky, heavy with thick gray clouds, seemed to hang low over the town, mirroring the heaviness in the hearts of its people. The air was cool and damp, as if the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something unnatural. The town, steeped in centuries of haunting history, a place forever marked by the scars of the infamous witch trials, would witness an event that would forever blur the lines between life, death, and something far darker. At the center of this unsettling event was Eliza Wells, a woman like many others in Salem, a devout wife and mother, known for her kindness and simple ways. She had lived in this town all her life, her family as old as the cobblestone streets they called home. There was nothing remarkable about her, that is, until her death. Eliza had been ill for several days. It started with a simple fever, one that she brushed off as a passing ailment. But soon, the fever grew more severe. She became pale, weakened, and unable to even rise from her bed. Her husband, Samuel Wells, a quiet and reserved man, did all he could to ease her suffering. He called upon the town's doctor, Dr. John Harvey, a man whose reputation for curing ailments was widely respected. However, the doctor's efforts were futile. Within hours, Eliza's condition worsened. She slipped into unconsciousness, her breath shallow and labored, until it ceased altogether. The official pronouncement of her death came shortly after. The doctor, after performing a brief examination, declared her gone, her life extinguished in the grip of a mysterious illness. A silent sadness fell over the Wells family. Samuel, heartbroken and lost, could scarcely believe the woman he had known for so many years had simply vanished from this world. Their young children huddled close to their father, not fully understanding the weight of what had happened, but sensing the heaviness in the air. It was at this point that a chilling set of events began to unfold. Word of Eliza's death quickly spread throughout Salem. The town, known for its dark history, had grown accustomed to death, but not like this. There was an unnatural quality to the way people spoke of Eliza's passing. Her death was not just a loss, it felt like the air had turned cold, as if something was hanging in the balance. Despite the sadness, preparations for her funeral began. The local church bell tolled, its somber chimes signaling the tragic event to the rest of the town. Samuel, devastated yet dutiful, oversaw the arrangement of his wife's burial. He instructed the undertaker to prepare a modest coffin, and a small gathering of mourners, mostly neighbors and a few friends, arrived to pay their respects. There was a strange stillness in the air as the funeral procession made its way to the graveyard. The usual chatter that accompanies such occasions was absent, replaced by whispers and uneasy glances. A faint chill ran through the crowd, though the spring air should have been warmer. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. As they reached the cemetery, a few of the more perceptive townsfolk noticed something odd, a faint light flickering in the distance, beyond the tall, arching trees that surrounded the burial grounds. Some whispered that it was nothing but a trick of the eye, an illusion caused by the shifting sunlight. But others felt it, a lingering sensation that something was about to happen, something neither natural nor explainable. Eliza's body was lowered into the grave, the earth taking her away from the living world. Samuel, his heart heavy, stood by the gravesite, his eyes filled with grief. It was a moment that should have been a final goodbye, a ritual to close the door on his wife's life. And yet, as the last shovel of dirt fell, something happened that no one could have prepared for, a quiet, breathless gasp from the crowd. The ground around Eliza's grave shifted, as if something was stirring beneath the earth. At first it was barely perceptible, a slight tremor that rippled through the soil. Then, a faint sound, like a low gasp, rose from the grave. It was so faint at first, no one was certain they had heard it. But then it came again, a slow, ragged breath. The crowd was stunned, frozen in place. Some took a step back, their eyes wide with disbelief, while others stepped closer, as if they could not trust their own senses. Then, the unimaginable happened. Eliza, whose body had been lifeless moments before, stirred. Her fingers twitched, her chest rose and fell, and she inhaled sharply, as if gasping for air after being submerged in water for far too long. Samuel, barely able to comprehend what was unfolding before him, reached out, trembling. His voice caught in his throat as he called her name, barely believing that his wife was once again alive. The crowd remained silent, too stunned to speak. Those who were close enough could see Eliza's eyes open slowly, blinking as though waking from a deep, unsettling dream. Her gaze was distant, unfocused. Her expression seemed confused, as if she had no recollection of how she had arrived at this moment, or why she was lying in a grave. A few whispered words escaped her lips, but they were incoherent, fragmented. Those who witnessed it could only describe the moment as surreal, as though time itself had bent in some unnatural way. The crowd was too shocked to react at first, and for a long moment, the only sound that could be heard was the rustling of the wind through the trees, as if the world itself was unsure of how to respond to this impossible event. Eliza's revival, or so it seemed, was not simply an unsettling curiosity, it was an act that would mark the beginning of an inexplicable mystery that would haunt Salem for decades to come. How could a woman who had been declared dead, whose body had already been sealed in a grave, now be standing before them, breathing, blinking, and alive? What had happened in the moments between her death and her resurrection? As the town gathered in shock, whispers began to spread. Some spoke of divine intervention, others of a medical anomaly, while some murmured darker theories. Eliza's miraculous return was far from a blessing for the Wells family. It would soon become clear that the mystery of her death and return would stir up something far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. The story of Eliza Wells would spiral into a chilling journey that blurred the lines between science, faith, and the very nature of life and death itself. But in that moment, standing at the edge of the grave, all anyone could do was watch in stunned silence, unsure of whether they were witnessing a miracle, an illusion, or something far more sinister. Salem in 1848 was a town steeped in both history and mystery. Though the horrors of the infamous witch trials had faded into the distant past, the shadow of those dark years still clung to the town like a heavy fog. The very name of Salem, whispered in corners across the United States and even Europe, conjured images of trials, of accusations, of women who had been burned alive or hanged at the gallows. But by the middle of the 19th century, the world around Salem had changed, though not as much as one might expect. The cobblestone streets, worn smooth from centuries of use, still echoed with the footsteps of townsfolk and visitors alike. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over the stones, the sound reverberating against the gray stone buildings that lined the streets. While the witch trials were now the stuff of history books and folklore, the remnants of those dark days still lingered. Old houses stood proudly, their creaking wooden structures bearing the marks of time, many of them filled with ghostly echoes of a past the town would rather forget. But the 19th century was a time of quiet upheaval for Salem. The Industrial Revolution had begun to touch the town, bringing with it the promise of modernity, though it arrived slowly, creeping in like the fog that so often rolled in from the sea. The first steamships had begun to dock at the harbor, and new technologies, like the telegraph and photography, were making their way into the hands of the curious. But the town itself, in many ways, remained trapped in its own history, clinging to its old traditions and superstitions. Despite the growing wave of scientific and industrial progress, Salem was still a place where the past had a way of asserting itself, where the weight of old beliefs, once discarded by other parts of the world, still held sway. It was here, in this curious mix of old and new, that Eliza Wells lived. Born and raised in Salem, Eliza was a woman of modest means. Her family, the Wells family, had long been part of the town's fabric. They were not wealthy, nor were they particularly famous, but they were well known and well liked, a family that had earned the respect of their neighbors. Eliza was the eldest of 5 children, and her upbringing was marked by the quiet, steady rhythm of rural life in New England. She was a devout woman, as was common in a town that had been shaped by its Puritan roots. Religion was a cornerstone of Salem's existence, its sermons reverberating through the town every Sunday, shaping the morals and values of the people who lived there. Eliza married Samuel Wells, a quiet, thoughtful man who had inherited a small farm just outside of town. Their life together was one of simple contentment. They were not wealthy, but they had enough to live comfortably. They had 2 children, a son named James and a daughter, Abigail. The family's life, while ordinary, was full of love and devotion, both to one another and to their community. They attended church regularly, and Eliza, known for her soft-spoken nature, had a reputation as a kind-hearted, gentle woman. If there was any blemish on her record, it was her tendency to worry, to be overly cautious at times, a trait that many in the town attributed to her religious devotion. But in the midst of all this ordinariness, there was an undeniable tension in the air. The quiet whispers of history seemed to hang over Salem, a town still haunted by its past. Old superstitions persisted. The townspeople were not quick to dismiss the unexplainable, the strange. In the darker corners of Salem, many still spoke of witches, of ghosts, of things that could not be easily explained by the new science that was beginning to take root. While the townsfolk had learned to speak of these things in hushed tones, they had not yet learned to fully dismiss them. There were places in the woods where no one dared to go after dark, and the graveyard just outside town was said to be haunted by the restless spirits of those who had been unjustly condemned centuries ago. Despite these undercurrents, life for the Wells family was peaceful. Eliza's life was one of devotion, to her family, to her faith, and to the quiet rhythms of rural existence. But little did they know that this idyllic existence was about to be shattered by an event that would challenge everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the very fabric of reality itself. The Wells family was not alone in their simple existence. Salem was a community of contradictions, a town proud of its place in history yet burdened by the weight of that history. As the town tried to shake off the lingering superstition that clung to it, there was still a deep-seated belief in things unseen, things unknown. Even as the world around them changed, as new ideas and new technologies began to infiltrate their lives, there was an undercurrent of fear that ran deep in Salem's veins. In 1848, Salem was also home to a small but growing community of intellectuals and scientists, who had begun to challenge the old ways of thinking. These men and women were part of a larger movement that sought to explain the world through reason and observation. They were the ones who dismissed the old superstitions and instead sought to uncover the truth through empirical evidence and scientific method. They were the ones who believed that death was the final frontier, an irreversible event that could not be undone. But there were also those in the town who held fast to the older beliefs. These people believed that death was not always the end, that there were forces at work in the world that could not be explained by science alone. And it was in this tension between the old and the new, the rational and the supernatural, that the mystery of Eliza Wells would unfold. As the days passed following her death, Eliza's return to life would begin to stir the town's old fears and superstitions. Those who had never truly let go of the past began to whisper that perhaps Eliza's revival was not a simple medical mistake, nor a divine miracle. Some began to speak of the possibility that something darker was at play, something that science could not explain, something that touched on the very boundaries of life and death. In the quiet corners of Salem, stories began to emerge of other strange occurrences, of unexplained events that seemed to be linked to Eliza's return. Salem, in 1848, was a place caught between 2 worlds. It was a place where the old fears and superstitions of the past rubbed uncomfortably against the rational, scientific thinking of the future. And it was in this tension that the true horror of Eliza Wells' story would begin to take root, as the town would soon find itself grappling with a mystery that defied all understanding, a mystery that would draw them back to the dark past they had tried so hard to forget, and force them to confront the terrifying possibility that some forces were simply beyond their control. The first signs that something was wrong with Eliza Wells didn't come all at once. They were subtle at first, like the quiet shift of the seasons, almost imperceptible, but there, lurking just beneath the surface. The town of Salem was used to unusual events, and for many of the townsfolk, strange occurrences were almost a part of life. But these signs, while small, began to accumulate, weaving an ominous thread through the fabric of Eliza's otherwise peaceful life. The first whispers didn't come until after her death, but looking back, those who knew her well would recall things that seemed inexplicable, things that, in retrospect, felt like warning signs. For months leading up to her illness, Eliza had been acting strangely, though no one had noticed it at the time. Her friends had brushed it off as stress or the result of overwork, but now, with the benefit of hindsight, they could see that her behavior was different in ways that no one could have expected. It began with her dreams. Eliza was a deeply devout woman, and her faith had always been a cornerstone of her life. She spent hours each week in prayer, and it wasn't unusual for her to speak of the dreams she had, believing them to be messages from God. But recently, her dreams had taken a darker turn. Her nights were filled with strange visions of darkness, figures in shadow, and voices that seemed to echo from far-off places. She would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she had been running for hours. But it wasn't just the dreams that disturbed her. There were the nights when she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something was watching her, waiting just out of sight. At first, Samuel, her husband, dismissed it as nothing more than stress. Eliza had been working tirelessly around the house, tending to their children, and managing the affairs of their modest farm. But as the weeks went on, Samuel began to notice a change in her behavior. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, and there were moments when she would simply stare off into the distance, as if lost in thought or consumed by some unseen force. She had always been a woman of faith, but now there were times when she questioned everything she had once believed. She began to wonder whether her dreams had some deeper meaning, whether they were a sign of something she couldn't yet understand. And then there were the strange occurrences that no one could explain. Neighbors reported seeing Eliza at odd hours, walking near the cemetery that lay on the edge of town, though she had never shown much interest in the place before. At first, it was just a fleeting observation, a passing glance of a woman walking in the twilight hours. But then, people began to notice that Eliza seemed to visit the cemetery more frequently, always at dusk or in the early morning hours, when the town was still wrapped in a heavy, misty fog. One neighbor, Mrs. Harper, a widowed woman who lived across the street from the Wells family, claimed to have seen Eliza standing at the cemetery gates on more than one occasion, staring into the darkness as though waiting for something. Mrs. Harper said she had seen Eliza's face illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern she carried, her expression unreadable, distant. It was not unusual for people in Salem to walk the cemetery, given the town's long history, but Mrs. Harper found Eliza's behavior unsettling. It was as though she were drawn to the place, as though something in the cemetery called to her. But when Mrs. Harper asked Eliza about it, she only shook her head and laughed nervously, claiming that it was nothing more than a random walk through the graveyard, a place where she often found solace. Then there was the time Eliza had a fall in the garden. She was tending to her vegetables one afternoon when she suddenly collapsed, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Samuel had rushed to her side, but by the time he reached her, she had already regained her senses and stood up as if nothing had happened. She claimed to have simply lost her balance, but there was something strange about the way she had fallen. It wasn't the stumble of someone who had tripped, but the kind of collapse one might expect from someone who had fainted, or worse. But when Samuel questioned her about it later, she simply brushed it off, saying she had been feeling faint but was otherwise fine. Perhaps the most telling of the early signs came during the weeks before Eliza's illness took hold of her. She began to complain of strange sensations, feelings of numbness and tingling in her fingers and toes, as though her limbs were slowly being disconnected from her body. Samuel, concerned, took her to Dr. Harvey, the town's physician, who performed a thorough examination. He found nothing physically wrong with her, no sign of any ailment that could explain the symptoms she described. He chalked it up to nervous exhaustion and recommended that she take some rest. But Eliza's condition continued to worsen, and soon the symptoms became more intense. Her fever set in, and with it, a growing sense of unease that no one in the family could shake. The final sign, the one that would mark the beginning of her illness, came on a night when Samuel woke to find Eliza standing by their bedroom window, staring out into the darkened yard. She was holding her lantern, the light flickering weakly, casting strange shadows across her face. Samuel had asked her what she was doing, but she simply replied, "I thought I heard something." Eliza had always been sensitive to noises in the night, especially after the children had gone to bed. But this time, Samuel noticed something different. Her voice lacked its usual clarity, and there was a strange edge to it, as though she were speaking from a place far removed from the present moment. When Samuel tried to pull her away from the window, she resisted, her eyes wide with a look of sheer terror. "Do not go near the door," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Do not open it." Samuel, alarmed by the strange tone in her voice, reached out to calm her, but Eliza recoiled as though something had just passed over her, something he couldn't see. She then collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably, but when Samuel asked what was wrong, she couldn't explain. There was no tangible threat outside. The yard was empty, the house still, the night as quiet as it had ever been. Yet in the pit of his stomach, Samuel knew something was wrong, profoundly wrong. Days later, Eliza's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Her fever became unrelenting, and the hallucinations began. She would mutter incoherently in her sleep, her words strange and disjointed, and in her moments of clarity, she spoke of figures she had seen in the house, shadows that would move when no one was near. "They're watching," she would say. "They're waiting for me." Her illness grew more severe, and soon her body began to weaken, slipping into a state of near lifelessness. Samuel, desperate and helpless, watched as the woman he loved faded away, her once strong and vibrant spirit consumed by an unseen force. But even as she grew weaker, there were moments, strange moments, when Eliza seemed to be somewhere else entirely, her eyes distant, as if gazing into some unfathomable place beyond the veil of the living. And it was at that moment, just days before her death, that something beyond comprehension would occur. What began as a series of subtle signs, strange dreams, mysterious wanderings, unexplained physical symptoms, now pointed to something far more sinister. The stage was set for Eliza's final collapse, but it would not be the end, not by a long shot. The strange things that had started to happen around her, the inexplicable behaviors, the visions, would soon escalate to an unimaginable level, one that no one in Salem would ever forget. The whispers started quietly at first, like a breeze through the branches of the old trees that lined the streets of Salem. But as the days passed and Eliza Wells' miraculous return to life became the talk of the town, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Those who had witnessed the event, the few who had stood by the grave and seen her stir, could hardly contain themselves. It was a story that felt too impossible to be true, yet there was no denying what they had seen. Some of them were afraid to speak of it too loudly, fearing the consequences of acknowledging something so unnatural. Others couldn't help themselves, the strangeness of it all burned within them, itching to be shared. It didn't take long before word spread to every corner of Salem. At first, most people treated the story as nothing more than a strange curiosity. A woman had died and then somehow come back to life. People had heard of things like this before, though rarely in such a close-knit community. Perhaps it was a medical anomaly, they thought. Perhaps it had been a mistake, a misdiagnosis. But even the most rational minds were soon gripped by doubt. As the story went on, it became clear that there were things about Eliza's return that couldn't be easily explained. The first witnesses were those who had been at the graveside, standing in the shadow of Eliza's grave as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. Samuel Wells, of course, was the most affected. He had seen his wife's body, cold and still, lifeless in the coffin, only to watch her revive before him. He had held her in his arms, watched her eyes flutter open, and heard her voice again. To him, it was a miracle, or so he wanted to believe. But as he tried to tell others about what had happened, something strange began to occur. The more he spoke of it, the less people believed him. At first, Samuel had been met with awe, even reverence. Some of the townsfolk had embraced the idea that this was a divine intervention, that Eliza's revival was a sign from God. These were the more superstitious folk, the ones who still clung to the old ways. They were ready to believe that some higher power had reached down and restored her to life. To them, Eliza was now more than just a woman, she was a symbol of divine grace, a living testament to the power of faith. But even within this group, there were doubts. The nature of her return, so sudden, so unnerving, made some uncomfortable. What kind of miracle would bring a person back from the dead, only for them to be so changed? Others, however, didn't share the same awe. They questioned what had really happened. How could a person return from the grave? It defied logic. It defied everything they knew about life and death. One of the first to voice their skepticism was Dr. John Harvey, the town physician who had pronounced Eliza dead in the first place. Dr. Harvey was a practical man, guided by reason and science. He had no use for religious explanations, and he certainly didn't believe in the supernatural. As far as he was concerned, Eliza's death had been a tragic but entirely natural event. She had succumbed to illness, and that was the end of it. When he was informed that Eliza had come back to life, Dr. Harvey's response was swift and unequivocal. It was a mistake, he said. There must have been some error in the diagnosis, some misunderstanding. Perhaps Eliza had merely slipped into a state of unconsciousness so deep that it had been mistaken for death. It was rare, but it had happened before. The body could appear lifeless, and the signs of death could be deceiving. But even as he spoke, Dr. Harvey could not shake the feeling that something was off. He had seen many deathbeds, many corpses, but he had never encountered anything like this. The idea that Eliza had somehow revived herself was simply too much for him to accept. Despite his insistence on a medical explanation, there was one thing that troubled him deeply, the way Eliza had looked when she had awakened. She had not been the same. Her face, once serene and peaceful, had appeared gaunt, her eyes unnaturally wide. She had not been the Eliza he remembered. Even in the moments when she was lucid, when she spoke, there was a coldness in her voice, an emptiness in her gaze, as though something was missing from her. Dr. Harvey could not explain it, but he knew that this was no simple case of mistaken death. He could not explain the change, but neither could he dismiss it entirely. The skepticism spread, and soon the town was divided. Some embraced the idea of divine intervention, while others, like Dr. Harvey, sought to rationalize the event through medical explanations. The first public meeting on the matter was held at the town hall, and it was packed with people from all walks of life. There were those who believed in Eliza's miraculous return, and there were those who wanted answers, who demanded an explanation. The tension in the room was palpable. The air was thick with uncertainty and fear. Some spoke in favor of Eliza's revival, praising it as a sign from above. Others, however, were not so sure. They questioned whether she had truly returned from the dead or if something darker was at work. The first rumors of Eliza's change began to spread in earnest after that meeting. It was said that Eliza had begun to act strangely. She would sit for hours in a trance-like state, her gaze fixed on some distant point, as though lost in her own thoughts. And when she spoke, her words were often incoherent, fragments of thoughts that seemed to have no logical connection. People started to say that she was not the same Eliza who had died, that something had come back with her, something that had altered her very essence. One of the first to speak publicly about these changes was Mrs. Harper, the neighbor who had seen Eliza near the cemetery before her death. She claimed that, even in the days following Eliza's return, there was something off about her. It wasn't just her appearance, though her once vibrant face now seemed dull and hollow. It was her eyes, Mrs. Harper said, the way they seemed to be searching for something, as though they were not truly seeing the world around her. Mrs. Harper was not the only one to notice this, and soon others began to report similar observations. The strange behavior didn't stop there. Eliza's once kind nature had changed, according to those who knew her best. She became more distant, withdrawn, and at times even appeared agitated for no apparent reason. She would startle easily, her eyes darting around as though she were expecting something, or someone, to appear. The town, already on edge from the strange event, grew more unsettled with each passing day. Was Eliza truly the same woman who had died? Or had something else come back in her place? The first whispers of supernatural explanations began to surface. Some of the more superstitious folk in Salem, those who had never fully embraced the scientific advancements of the day, began to speak of dark forces at play. They whispered of a curse, of a restless spirit that had taken hold of Eliza's body, or even of something darker, something that had crossed over from the afterlife and now walked among them. These whispers found fertile ground in a town like Salem, a town with such a storied history of witch trials and dark legends. Even those who had once dismissed such notions began to feel the stirrings of fear in their hearts. As the days wore on, the whispers grew into something more. The town became divided. Families turned against one another, torn between those who believed in the miracle and those who feared the consequences of it. What had happened to Eliza Wells? Was she truly alive again? Or had something far darker, far more sinister, returned in her place? The questions only deepened with each passing day, and the mystery of Eliza's resurrection would soon take on a life of its own, its echoes reverberating through the town for years to come. As the days turned into weeks following Eliza Wells' inexplicable return from the dead, the town of Salem found itself at a crossroads. The mysterious events surrounding her revival sparked debates, but it was the town's leaders, particularly the religious figures, who would set the tone for how the community responded to this unprecedented phenomenon. While whispers of dark forces and supernatural explanations circulated among the townsfolk, the official stance was one of denial. The religious community, ever watchful of the influence of superstition, was determined to suppress the growing panic and fear that had begun to take root in Salem. They saw in Eliza's return not a divine miracle but a dangerous breach of natural law, a phenomenon that could lead the town down a perilous path of heresy and chaos. Father Samuel Giles, the town's oldest and most respected clergyman, was the first to publicly address the event. A man of devout faith and a deep sense of religious duty, Father Giles had presided over Salem's pulpit for over 30 years. He was a stern figure, known for his unwavering adherence to biblical doctrine, and he carried the weight of Salem's religious history on his shoulders. He was the man who had spoken with authority during the witch trials over a century ago, and now, as Salem faced a new kind of crisis, his voice would once again try to steer the town's moral compass. The sermon Father Giles delivered on the matter of Eliza Wells was a studied performance of caution and denial. Standing at the pulpit, the weathered preacher spoke with a calm authority, attempting to quell the rising panic that had begun to ripple through Salem. He began by reaffirming the teachings of the Church, that death was final, that it was a passage ordained by God, and that the living could not return once they had crossed to the other side. Father Giles declared, in no uncertain terms, that Eliza's revival was nothing more than an unfortunate series of misunderstandings and that the townspeople should not let their imaginations run wild with superstitions. However, as he continued his sermon, a hint of unease crept into his voice. He urged his flock to pray for Eliza, to seek God's forgiveness on her behalf, but he also made it clear that the event was to be treated as a medical anomaly. He denounced the rumors of divine intervention, speaking against the notion that Eliza's return was a sign from God. This, he said, was a dangerous belief. Father Giles argued that the human soul could not be returned from death, for once God had called a soul to rest, it could not be undone. To suggest otherwise, he warned, was to challenge the very order of creation, a perilous step toward heresy. Despite his best efforts to quell the growing hysteria, Father Giles' words had little effect on the growing unrest among Salem's more superstitious residents. For many, the idea that Eliza Wells could return from the grave was impossible to dismiss so easily. To them, it was clear, something supernatural had occurred. Eliza had died and then, through forces beyond the natural world, had come back to life. The stories from the first witnesses were too vivid, too unsettling to ignore. What was Eliza now? A miracle? A curse? Or something even darker? It wasn't just the stories of Eliza's revival that stirred fears, it was the strange behavior she exhibited afterward, the chilling changes in her demeanor, the way she seemed to be a shadow of her former self. Some even began to whisper that her return was less a resurrection and more a possession, that something dark had entered her body and soul, twisting her once gentle nature into something unrecognizable. These rumors spread like wildfire, stoked by fear and disbelief. But despite the growing unease among the townsfolk, the church remained resolute in its stance. Father Giles and the other religious leaders maintained that this was a matter for reason and science, not superstition. They publicly rebuked those who spoke of Eliza's return as a divine miracle, cautioning the people of Salem not to give in to their fears and let themselves be swayed by unreasoning belief. But the town was not so easily pacified. People began to distance themselves from the Wells family, either out of fear or out of a desire to protect their own reputations. The Wells family, once respected and well-liked, now found themselves at the center of a controversy that threatened to divide the community. Samuel Wells, Eliza's husband, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in his household, but the tension was palpable. He, too, had questions, doubts that gnawed at him even as he clung to the hope that his wife's return was a blessing. But the more he saw of her, the more he feared that something had changed, something that could not be explained away by science or religion. While Father Giles and his followers insisted on medical explanations for Eliza's revival, some of the townsfolk, particularly those from the older, more traditional families, began to take matters into their own hands. They turned to other forms of spiritual guidance, seeking out those who were more open to the idea that Eliza's return was not a mere accident, but something more sinister. These individuals, some of them healers, some of them spiritualists, became the new voices of authority in Salem, offering their own interpretations of the events surrounding Eliza's death and resurrection. It wasn't long before an underground movement began to form, made up of those who believed that Eliza's revival was not to be feared, but celebrated. They viewed her as a symbol of something beyond the natural world, something that defied the laws of man and nature. They saw in her return the proof of a greater mystery, one that the church and science could not explain. For them, Eliza was the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of life, death, and the spaces in between. They began to meet in secret, gathering in small groups to discuss what had happened, to seek answers that no one in the public eye was willing to provide. But the more these gatherings grew, the more the church sought to suppress them. Father Giles, once again at the forefront of the religious community, issued a stern warning to anyone who dared to challenge the official stance. He reminded the townspeople that the Bible was clear, death was a part of God's plan, and any attempt to subvert that plan was an affront to the Almighty. He called upon the leaders of Salem to act swiftly, to stop the spread of these dangerous ideas before they took root and caused irreparable harm. The struggle between faith and reason, between those who saw Eliza's revival as a divine intervention and those who viewed it as a curse, reached a fever pitch. The town became divided, torn between those who believed in the supernatural and those who rejected it outright. Those who stood on the side of reason, those who clung to the teachings of the church and the explanations of science, found themselves at odds with the growing number of believers in the supernatural. In the end, Salem, a town built on religious foundation and a deep-rooted belief in the afterlife, was left to grapple with a question that would haunt it for years: could life, once extinguished, truly be brought back? And if it could, what dark forces were at work? The battle for the truth of Eliza Wells' return would continue to divide the town, with no clear resolution in sight. The church had spoken, but so had those who rejected its authority. As the mystery deepened, the lines between belief and denial grew ever more blurred. And in the midst of it all, Eliza Wells, once a symbol of purity and grace, stood at the heart of it all, a living enigma whose very existence seemed to threaten everything Salem had ever known. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in Salem grew heavier, more oppressive. What had begun as a quiet, unsettling event had now escalated into something far more profound. Eliza Wells, once a simple woman beloved by her family and community, was now at the center of a growing psychological storm. Her return from the dead was no longer just an issue of religious or scientific debate, it had become a matter of collective anxiety. The emotional and psychological toll on the people of Salem was becoming undeniable. Fear, confusion, and unease spread throughout the town, like a sickness that no one could quite name but everyone felt. The first signs of the psychological impact came from those closest to Eliza, her family. Samuel Wells, her husband, was torn between the overwhelming joy of having his wife back and the creeping fear that something was wrong, something fundamentally altered in her. As days passed, Eliza seemed more distant, more unmoored from the world around her. She had moments of clarity, but they were increasingly fleeting, replaced by long stretches of unnerving silence. Her gaze would often drift, as though she were staring at something invisible in the distance, her expression distant and uncomprehending. It was as though the woman who had once been his beloved wife had been replaced by someone, or something, else. Samuel tried his best to maintain a sense of normalcy for the sake of their children, but even they could feel the change. James and Abigail, young as they were, had known their mother as a loving, attentive presence in their lives. But now, there was a coldness in Eliza's interactions with them, a detachment that both frightened and confused them. They would reach out for her touch, but she would pull away, as if she were physically unable to offer comfort. It was as though the connection that had once bound them had been severed, leaving an empty space in its wake. For Samuel, the experience was akin to watching someone you love slip away without ever truly leaving. He had seen his wife's lifeless body laid to rest, and now here she was again, in the flesh, but not the same. His mind, torn between disbelief and hope, could not reconcile the woman he had loved with the stranger who now stood before him. Was this truly Eliza, or had something else taken possession of her? The question gnawed at him, and the psychological strain was beginning to take its toll. Samuel found himself losing sleep, unable to shake the images of Eliza's vacant stare, her unnerving silence, and the coldness in her once warm touch. But it wasn't just the Wells family who felt the effects of Eliza's return. The town of Salem itself seemed to be unraveling, each day bringing more signs of an underlying tension. Those who had once been Eliza's friends now found themselves avoiding her, not out of malice, but out of a deep, instinctual fear. There was something unsettling about her presence, something that made people feel as though they were in the presence of a stranger, not the woman they had known. And it wasn't just her demeanor, it was the strange occurrences that seemed to follow her wherever she went. People spoke of hearing unexplainable sounds near her house at night, the sound of whispers in the wind, or the faint echo of a voice that could not be placed. Others swore they saw shadows moving in the corners of their vision when they passed by the Wells home, as if something or someone were watching them from within. The psychological impact on the townspeople was compounded by the fact that no one had any answers. The medical community was of little help. Dr. John Harvey, who had initially dismissed Eliza's revival as a mistake, had been unable to offer any explanation for her strange behavior. As much as he had wanted to rationalize the situation, he was confronted with something that defied reason. The more he observed Eliza, the more confused he became. His medical training offered no insight into the changes in her behavior, nor could it explain the unshakable feeling of unease that hung over her. Dr. Harvey, usually a man of calm logic, found himself grappling with a question he could not answer. Was Eliza truly alive again? Or was something else at play? Something darker. The toll on the community was not just psychological, it was social. Friends turned against one another, torn between those who insisted that Eliza's revival was a miracle and those who feared the consequences of such an event. The divide grew wider each day, with accusations of heresy and superstition being hurled in both directions. People began to look at one another with suspicion, as if each person's opinion on Eliza's return revealed something about their character, their beliefs, their very souls. It was as though the town's faith had been shattered, and without that shared foundation, the very social fabric of Salem began to tear apart. In this climate of fear and confusion, paranoia set in. What had once been a tight-knit community was now a town divided, with factions forming around those who believed Eliza's return was a divine sign and those who feared it was the work of the devil. People began to isolate themselves, avoiding one another in the streets and whispering behind closed doors. Neighbors, once friends, became wary of one another, unsure of where loyalties lay. The sense of security that had once permeated Salem was replaced by an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Even the town's religious leaders, who had initially tried to suppress the rumors and reassert control, began to feel the strain. Father Giles, the once respected preacher, had always been able to rely on the unquestioning faith of his flock. But now, that faith was being tested in ways he had never anticipated. The psychological pressure of trying to maintain order in the face of a mystery that had no clear explanation weighed heavily on him. As he preached his sermons, trying to bring a sense of peace and normalcy to the town, he found himself losing confidence in his own words. The doubt, which had once seemed a distant possibility, now gnawed at him. What if Eliza's return was a sign of something much darker than he could fathom? What if the forces at play here were beyond the reach of the church, beyond anything he had ever encountered in his decades of service? The psychological effects of Eliza's revival were not confined to those who knew her directly. As the town grew more divided and the psychological pressure mounted, strange behaviors began to manifest in the wider population. People who had once been calm and rational found themselves experiencing inexplicable fears, waking up in the middle of the night with a sense of dread, certain that they were being watched. Children, who had once been carefree, began to speak of seeing strange shadows moving outside their windows at night. Some even reported hearing whispers, words they couldn't understand, coming from the walls of their homes. It was as though the very fabric of Salem had been altered, its inhabitants caught in a collective state of psychological unrest. By now, it was clear that Eliza's return had not only shaken the foundations of the Wells family but had also taken a toll on the collective psyche of the town. What had once been a simple, tragic event had become something far more disturbing, a mystery that refused to be solved. The psychological strain on everyone involved, from Samuel Wells to the townsfolk who had once known Eliza, was growing unbearable. The town of Salem, its people torn between fear and hope, was now trapped in a cycle of uncertainty, its very sense of reality crumbling as the boundaries between life and death, faith and reason, began to blur. As the mystery surrounding Eliza Wells' return from the grave continued to deepen, the town of Salem, now consumed by fear, began to seek out rational explanations. The religious fervor that had initially swept through the community had begun to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease about the lack of answers. People were no longer content to rely solely on spiritual explanations or divine miracles. They demanded a logical resolution, something that could put an end to the panic and restore a sense of normalcy to their lives. In response to this growing demand, the town's intellectuals, including medical professionals and scholars, began to formulate theories, some plausible, others absurd, to explain what had happened to Eliza. The first scientific theory that gained traction was the idea of a medical anomaly, specifically that Eliza had been mistakenly pronounced dead. Dr. John Harvey, the town's trusted physician who had been present when Eliza's death was officially recorded, was the first to publicly entertain this possibility. He had initially rejected the notion of her revival as a simple error in diagnosis, but as the weeks went on and more people expressed their concerns, he began to reconsider. His medical training told him that it was possible for a person to enter a state of extreme unconsciousness, a condition so deep that it appeared to mimic death. The heart might stop beating, the body might become cold, and the breath may be undetectable, all symptoms that could easily be mistaken for death. Dr. Harvey suggested that Eliza had been in such a state, so deep that even a trained physician like himself had overlooked the signs of life. He theorized that Eliza had been buried prematurely, only to awaken in the grave, revived by the natural processes of her body. This theory, while still unlikely, seemed plausible to some of the more scientifically minded residents of Salem. They accepted the possibility of a medical misdiagnosis, allowing them to maintain their belief in the laws of nature without resorting to supernatural explanations. However, there were those who found this theory unsatisfactory. To them, the idea that Eliza could have been mistaken for dead was simply not enough to explain the changes in her behavior. Eliza had not merely revived, something about her had fundamentally changed. Her physical appearance was altered, her behavior strange and disquieting, and her once warm and loving personality seemed absent. Some of the townsfolk began to wonder if there was something more to Eliza's return than just a medical mistake. They speculated that she might have been subjected to some kind of unnatural force, some unknown scientific phenomenon that had reanimated her body. The more curious minds turned to theories of human resurrection, a concept that had long been the subject of scientific speculation and philosophical debate. One of the more daring ideas proposed by a few of the more progressive thinkers in Salem was that Eliza had been affected by some form of life force, an unknown energy that had somehow been transferred back into her body, causing it to revive. This theory was rooted in the early, rudimentary studies of electricity and magnetism that had begun to emerge in Europe and the Americas. Some believed that a jolt of energy, similar to the ones used in early experiments with electrical stimulation of muscles, had somehow triggered Eliza's revival. Though no one could explain how this energy had entered her body, the theory gained some popularity among those who were desperate for a rational explanation. There were even more far-fetched theories circulating among the more eccentric members of the town. Some suggested that Eliza had been exposed to a rare and exotic disease, one that caused a temporary suspension of the body's vital functions, mimicking death, before eventually leading to a spontaneous revival. This theory, though scientifically implausible, found some traction among those who were more inclined to entertain unconventional ideas. A few even went so far as to suggest that Eliza had been subjected to some kind of chemical or alchemical process, a strange concoction that had preserved her body in a state of suspended animation, only for it to be reawakened when the right conditions were met. While these theories grew more fantastical, one thing was clear: no one had any concrete answers. The medical community, which had once held a position of unquestioned authority, now found itself on shaky ground. Even Dr. Harvey, who had initially dismissed the supernatural explanations, was forced to admit that there were aspects of the case that defied his understanding. The medical theories, while somewhat comforting in their attempt to make sense of the situation, were not enough to assuage the growing fears of the townspeople. The scientific community had no concrete evidence to support any of these theories, and as the weeks passed, it became clear that the true nature of Eliza's revival remained an enigma. As the scientific theories continued to unfold, there were those in Salem who, unable to reconcile the event with any known laws of nature, began to turn to alternative explanations. The more superstitious residents, who had once accepted religious explanations for Eliza's revival, now began to entertain other possibilities, including the idea that she had been brought back to life by dark forces, by some malevolent power that was beyond human comprehension. These theories were fueled by the strange behavior Eliza exhibited in the weeks following her revival. People reported seeing her eyes flicker with unnatural intensity, her movements too jerky, too mechanical, as though she were being controlled by some unseen hand. There were whispers of possession, of a spirit that had taken hold of her body and was using it for its own purposes. Some of the town's more radical thinkers suggested that Eliza's revival was the result of a collision between the natural and supernatural realms. They speculated that something in the fabric of the universe, an unexplainable force, had temporarily bridged the gap between life and death, allowing Eliza to return. They argued that this breach in the natural order was not only a sign of the existence of forces beyond the comprehension of man but also a harbinger of darker things to come. The town, they feared, was on the verge of a great unraveling, a collapse of the very laws that governed life and death. But even as these theories swirled, there was a quiet but growing realization among the people of Salem that none of these explanations truly accounted for the full scope of what had happened. They could not explain why Eliza had been brought back to life, why her behavior had changed so dramatically, or why, despite the many efforts to rationalize her return, there remained an undeniable sense of something profoundly wrong. In the face of their confusion, the townspeople turned to one final explanation, one that would serve as a balm for their fractured minds, but would ultimately prove no more satisfying than the others. Eliza's return, they concluded, must be a divine mystery. It was not for them to understand. Some accepted it as a miracle, a testament to God's power. Others, still unsure, reluctantly came to believe that the answers lay beyond human comprehension. In the end, none of the theories fully explained what had happened to Eliza Wells. The scientific attempts to explain the phenomenon, while offering some comfort, did little to calm the town's growing sense of dread. The supernatural theories, though emotionally resonant, only deepened the fear that something darker was at work. And so, the mystery remained unsolved, hanging over the town like an ever-present shadow. The attempts to explain Eliza's return had done little to lift the veil of uncertainty, leaving Salem more divided, more fearful, and more lost in the fog of the unknown than ever before. As the weeks continued to pass after Eliza Wells' mysterious return from the dead, the tension in Salem reached a breaking point. What had once been a curious event, unsettling but perhaps explainable, had now evolved into a catastrophe that seemed to unravel the very fabric of the town. The more the town tried to make sense of the events, the more fragmented it became. Theories, doubts, and fears accumulated, but no clear resolution ever emerged. Instead, what had been a community bound by shared history and faith began to disintegrate, as neighbors turned on one another, and the once vibrant streets of Salem grew eerily quiet. The collapse was not just social or psychological, it was spiritual and existential. The town found itself caught in a whirlpool of questions with no answers, its foundations slowly eroding under the weight of the impossible. The Wells family, at the heart of the storm, was the first to experience the profound isolation that followed. Samuel Wells, who had once clung to the belief that Eliza's return was some sort of divine miracle, now found himself facing a new, more painful truth. The community that had supported him through the death of his wife now shunned him, his once close neighbors now distancing themselves from the family. The whispered rumors and suspicions had grown too loud, too insistent. The dark, unsolvable mystery of Eliza's return seemed to hang over their house like a curse. Samuel's internal battle intensified. He could no longer dismiss the growing dread in his heart, the sense that his wife was no longer the person he had loved. He had watched her, day by day, change before his eyes, slipping further away from him into a strange, unexplainable state. Her actions, her mannerisms, the way she looked at him and their children, it was as though she had become a stranger. Her once warm smile had been replaced by a coldness that chilled him to the bone. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with life, now seemed to hold something else, a vacancy, an emptiness. Despite her being physically alive, there was an unmistakable sense that Eliza was no longer truly there. Samuel's despair deepened, and he began to wonder if she was somehow trapped in her own body, a prisoner of forces beyond her control. This thought, coupled with the growing fear from the townsfolk, pushed him to the brink of a breaking point. As his mind spiraled, he sought solace in religion, hoping that a prayer or an exorcism might restore Eliza to the woman she had been. He turned to Father Samuel Giles, who, after initially downplaying the situation, began to show signs of exhaustion. The spiritual leader, once so certain in his convictions, now seemed wary and unsure. The town was falling apart, and Father Giles, despite his best efforts, could no longer maintain control. It had become clear to him that no matter how much he tried to rationalize or deny the unnatural events unfolding, something far beyond human comprehension was at play. But even he was caught in a bind. To confront the supernatural forces that might be influencing Eliza could be seen as a challenge to his authority and the very principles of his faith. To act decisively would risk the wrath of both the townspeople and the higher church authorities. And so, the priest withdrew further, consumed by his own doubts. Eliza's revival, instead of being a blessing, had become a fracture point in the town's social and spiritual structure. What had once been a place of communal prayer, unity, and collective faith had now descended into a state of suspicion and fear. The well-organized, orderly life that the people of Salem had once taken for granted began to crumble. The religious leaders, unable to offer meaningful answers, were now seen by many as impotent. The medical community, still unable to provide a solid explanation for Eliza's return, had lost its credibility. And with no explanation that satisfied anyone, the town began to lose its sense of identity. Rumors of strange occurrences, odd phenomena, and unexplainable behavior grew more rampant. People who had once been firm believers in the power of the church and in the authority of science began to wonder if they had been wrong all along. A sense of hopelessness filled the air. The very ground beneath them seemed unstable, as if the town itself was being pulled in multiple directions by forces it could neither understand nor control. Families grew wary of one another. No one felt safe. Conversations that once took place on front porches turned into hushed whispers behind closed doors. The people of Salem, unsure of who to trust, became increasingly isolated. In the midst of this, Eliza Wells herself began to withdraw. Once a vibrant woman, she became more reclusive with each passing day. Her family, once her refuge, was now a place of tension and unease. She would sit for hours, staring into space, as if lost in a world no one could reach. Sometimes, she would speak, but her words were disjointed, disconnected from reality. She would speak of strange visions, of voices that only she could hear, of a darkness that called to her from somewhere beyond the grave. Samuel, desperate to understand, tried to reach her, but the woman he had loved seemed to be slipping away, fading into a ghost of her former self. The community's isolation deepened as well. People began to leave Salem in small groups, unable to live with the ever-growing sense of unease that had permeated the town. There were those who fled in fear of Eliza, afraid that something evil had taken hold of her and might eventually consume them all. Others, unable to bear the psychological toll of living in such a fractured town, simply packed their belongings and left, hoping to escape the madness that seemed to grip Salem. Some of the families that remained became increasingly insular, preferring the company of a few trusted individuals rather than risk encountering the unknown. It wasn't just the physical presence of Eliza that caused the unease, it was the feeling that the laws of nature itself had been broken. Death was supposed to be final, an immutable part of the human experience. But Eliza's return had shattered that certainty. What did it mean for the people of Salem if the boundaries between life and death could be so easily crossed? What did it mean if the impossible was now possible? In a place where belief in the afterlife and the sanctity of the soul had once been central to life, the mere existence of Eliza's revival cast doubt on everything. If one woman could defy the laws of life and death, what else could be possible? What other forbidden forces were lurking in the darkness? Eventually, even the Wells family could not hold together. Samuel's increasing desperation to understand his wife's condition, coupled with the weight of the town's growing paranoia, led to an irreversible breakdown. There were days when Samuel couldn't bear to face Eliza at all. He would leave the house, walking aimlessly through the empty streets of the town, desperate for any kind of clarity. Meanwhile, Eliza, in her own silent anguish, became more withdrawn, less present in her own life. It was as though she had accepted her fate, whatever it was, and retreated into the unknown spaces of her mind. Her revival had not brought her peace, it had only left her stranded between worlds. The collapse of Salem was not dramatic, not sudden, but it was inevitable. One by one, the people left. Some never returned. Those who remained were forever changed, their lives scarred by the eerie presence of the Wells family and the inexplicable events surrounding Eliza's revival. Over time, Salem became a town known for its ghosts, not just the ones from its dark past, but the living ghosts who had walked among the living and died too soon, never to return whole again. As the town emptied, the story of Eliza Wells faded into legend, a mystery that no one truly understood, and a wound that time could never heal. In the end, Eliza herself disappeared into the folds of Salem's forgotten history. There were no grand revelations, no sweeping conclusions. She had returned once, only to vanish into the shadowy corners of the past, leaving behind a town broken by the weight of the unexplainable, a town that would never truly recover. The mystery of her return, like so many others, would remain unresolved, an open wound in the heart of a once hopeful community, left to haunt the living for generations to come. As the years passed, the story of Eliza Wells faded from the public eye, slipping into the quiet darkness of local folklore. The town of Salem, once consumed by the strange and terrifying mystery surrounding her return from the grave, had become a ghost of its former self. Those who had been part of the ordeal, those who had witnessed Eliza's death and revival, found themselves increasingly reluctant to speak of it. The burden of the mystery had been too heavy, and the psychological scars too deep. What had started as an unsettling event soon became a subject of shame and fear, something best left unspoken. And so, the town of Salem retreated into itself, locking away the story of Eliza Wells as if it were an unwanted secret, a shadow that no one dared acknowledge. For the Wells family, the aftermath of Eliza's return was equally silent and isolating. Samuel Wells, once a proud man whose wife had been the heart of their family, became a broken figure, overshadowed by the grief and confusion that had haunted him since Eliza's inexplicable revival. In the years following her return, Samuel found himself living a life of quiet desperation, moving through the motions of daily existence without ever truly feeling alive. His once vibrant home had become a mausoleum, a place filled with memories of a woman who no longer existed in the same way. Eliza's transformation, her eerie behavior, and her eventual withdrawal into herself had left a gaping wound in the heart of the Wells family. Samuel, now a man older than his years, had grown increasingly distant, not only from the town but from his own children. James and Abigail, who had once been so full of life, found themselves growing up in the shadow of their mother's mysterious return. Their childhoods, which should have been filled with joy and laughter, were marred by the unsettling presence of a mother who was there but not there. Their memories of Eliza before her death, warm, nurturing, and full of love, now stood in stark contrast to the woman who had returned. Eliza, though physically present, had become a stranger in her own home. She was distant, uncommunicative, and strangely cold. The children had no one to turn to, no one who could explain what had happened to their mother or why she was so different. It was as if they had been abandoned not just by her, but by their own sense of reality. The grief they felt was not just for their mother but for a version of their lives that had been irrevocably lost. In the years that followed, as the town's collective memory of the event began to fade, Samuel's isolation deepened. He retreated further into himself, unable to find solace in the town he had once called home. Salem, with its quiet streets and empty houses, seemed to mock him with its emptiness. The once thriving community that had been so full of life now felt like a shadow of its former self. And in the hollow silence that enveloped the town, Samuel found himself growing bitter. How could he explain what had happened to his wife? How could he reconcile the woman he had known with the cold, distant figure she had become? No one in Salem seemed to care anymore, no one seemed to want to know the truth. Eliza had returned, but what had come back was not the woman Samuel had loved. It was something else, something beyond his understanding. The townspeople, for their part, had their own reasons for avoiding the subject of Eliza Wells. Over time, the events surrounding her return became a kind of unspoken taboo. People who had once whispered in dark corners about the strange things they had seen or heard now turned a blind eye to the past. It was as though, collectively, the town had decided that it was better to forget, better to leave the mystery buried and unexplored. Fear had given way to an uncomfortable silence, and the more the townspeople tried to ignore the past, the more they found themselves living in its shadow. The story of Eliza Wells, which had once been a topic of heated debate, became little more than a faint echo, a whisper on the wind that no one dared to hear. As the decades passed, those who had lived through the events surrounding Eliza's return began to die off.